New York, 1854. On Fifth Avenue, where polished carriages stitched silver lines along the winter dusk, a limestone townhouse held itself like a vow. Gaslight touched the cornices, the parlor's velvet drapes drank it in. To passers-by, the residence was a monument to benevolence, a private convalescent retreat endowed by a family whose name opened doors from bank lobbies to museum halls. Inside, servants spoke in the low grammar of reverence. A delicate child, an invalid, a blessing to be sheltered from public unkindness. Her name in the household ledger was Anna May, age 17. The official account was soft as damask. She had fallen into a mysterious sleep and did not wake. What began as mercy, records show, would spiral into orchestration. The house was not a sanctuary, it was a theater. Stage-managed darkness, measured doses, and a locked door that mended nothing. Before we peel back the wallpaper and the good manners, subscribe to this investigation and comment your city. These episodes stitch a hidden map across America's gilded streets. Your voice tells us where to follow the paper. Beneath the mantel, a false panel. Behind the panel, letters, 12 of them, folded into triangles, each sealed with wax-stamped HK and a sprig-shaped device the color of dried blood. The earliest bore the date March 3, 1854, the latest September 1, 1871. Their author wrote like a physician-banker, curt, careful and certain, cataloguing doses and behavior as if humanity were an account to be balanced. Minute drafts only, laudanum, then bromide. Keep the curtains drawn. The public loves a miracle, we will sell them one. The wax emblem would later appear again in an account book pulled from a broker's safe, a sprig not of laurel, but foxglove, digitalis, heartflower, a cure and a blade in the same petal. The townhouse facade promised charity. The interior rehearsed control, visit. Doors were ushered to a drawing room chased with polished silver and theological biographies. They were told that Anna's constitution was fragile and that the Beaumont Fund, a philanthropy born of a manufacturing fortune, had pledged to ensure her comfort indefinitely. The city applauded, ladies brought flowers, priests offered prayers, newspapers serialized her sleep with the same zeal they lavished on yacht races and scandal trials. The official story acquired a halo. But the hidden truth was typed in the margins of commerce. Newly discovered correspondence details monthly disbursements from the Beaumont Fund to a private sanitarium upstate, and retainers paid to a Dr. Horace Kincaid, H.K., whose reputation depended on being consulted for cases that never improved. The sums were too neat, the durations too convenient. The sleep produced endless sympathy, and sympathy funded institutions. What looked like pity yielded profit. It is an old American arithmetic. A maid's sworn statement, buried in a municipal archive mislabeled supply invoices lamps, described tonics, delivered in unmarked bottles, always at dusk. She was told to mix them with milk. In one entry, she adds a sentence not meant for the ledger. When I read to the girl, she stirred at the psalms and tried to speak, sir. The doctor said my memory was a woman's fancy. Weeks later, her wages doubled and her name disappeared from payroll. The townhouse still stands, stripped and refitted, made fashionable again, but restoration workers in 1896 found a second panel, this one behind a bookcase of sermons. There was no scripture inside. There was a list, names, dates, sums, code names. At the bottom, written in a firmer hand, AM, indefinite. They called it guardianship. The letters call it something else. On the third page of the first letter, in ink that has browned to the color of tea, the line is simple, almost superior. Mug, and it does not tremble. The dose was perfect. The year was 1854, but the stage had been set long before. In a city gilded by railroad fortunes and shadowed by cholera graves, the Beaumont family held a peculiar prestige. Their fortune began with mills along the Hudson, then deepened with investments in rail lines and insurance. By mid-century, they were invited to the very tables where banking policy was whispered into existence. To the public, they were a family of benevolence, patrons of libraries, underwriters of lectures, founders of the Beaumont Fund for Invalid Children. Their townhouse was more than residence, it was a monument of virtue.
1. 1854. The Townhouse. 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 1854. The Town
But when Anna May collapsed at a dinner service in March of that year, the official story wrapped itself too tightly, too quickly. Guests recalled the scene, the faint clatter of silver, the silence that followed. A physician, just happening to dine nearby, pronounced it a mysterious nervous seizure. Within hours, newspapers had the phrasing exact, as though a press agent had dictated the copy. By dawn, broadsheets carried the headline, "The Sleeping Angel of Fifth Avenue." The tale ignited sympathy. Crowds gathered daily, pressing flowers into the iron gate. Hymns were sung. Strangers wept in unison for a girl they had never seen. The Beaumonts accepted the public's grief with solemn grace, repeating the same phrases. She rests. She is safe. She feels no pain. But the documents tell a different story. Before I continue, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment whether you've ever walked past a house that felt wrong. These records prove the walls themselves remember. Servants whispered of odd behaviors in the days before her collapse. Anna May had become restless at night, pacing the corridor in a thin white gown, muttering phrases in Latin, phrases no one claimed to have taught her. A footman noted her refusal of wine, though she had been encouraged to drink it, but for constitution. Another wrote that she stared at the silver cruets as though they contained something more than oil and vinegar. On the night itself, one testimony contradicted the polished narrative. A kitchen maid, later dismissed without references, claimed she saw Dr. Horace Kincaid already in the vestibule before Anna fell. His gloves were still damp, though the night was dry. He was not a dinner guest, but he entered the parlor at the precise moment of collapse, as if summoned. The city applauded the Beaumonts for shielding their daughter from spectacle. Yet within weeks, letters arrived by courier to the townhouse at precise intervals, folded, sealed, signed only, HK. They were never acknowledged publicly. When one was dropped in error, a butler intercepted it and burned it in the scullery stove. But ash, like memory, clings. That fragment, later retrieved, spelled only 3 words in a hurried scrawl. Tincture arrives. Tuesday. Anna May was moved to an upstairs chamber with velvet curtains drawn at all times. The explanation: sensitivity to light. But seamstresses called to repair the fabric reported the glass behind it had been painted over, not simply curtained, but blackened. And then there was the ledger. Not the Beaumont Fund's official account book, but a private household ledger tucked into the desk of the patriarch himself. On the page marked parlor provisions, beneath lists of coal deliveries and upholstery repairs, a single line item appeared every month without fail. Medicinal drafts. HK. No cost was listed. Only the initials. The world beyond the gate saw only sanctity, but inside the walls, anomalies gathered like mold behind plaster. Anna May did not simply fall asleep. She was made to sleep, and her silence produced a currency no less real than the notes traded at Wall Street desks. One of Kincaid's surviving notes ends with a S, intense, clinical in its cruelty. The performance must not be interrupted. In the archive of the municipal court, misfiled under Estate Disputes 1872, there exists a deposition that never reached a jury. The witness was a dismissed footman, Thomas Ellery, who swore under oath that during his final week of service he had been ordered to polish the oak desk in Mr. Beaumont's study. The drawers were meant to remain locked. But on that March afternoon, one key was left carelessly in place. Inside, Ellery claimed, lay a packet of letters bound with silk cord. The first he opened bore the mark already known to us, HK. Its script was surgical, without flourish. It described not mercy but maintenance. The girl will stir when read to. Dosage must be corrected. Increase laudanum by 2 drops at dusk. The lines were clinical, the tone proprietary. Ellery panicked. He replaced the letter, tied the cord, shut the drawer, but the words burned through him. Within days he was dismissed for insolence. His testimony was buried, his credibility shredded. The Beaumonts called him a thief. The press called him a liar, yet the document remained in municipal custody because of one clerk who scribbled "retain" in the margin. That faint instruction preserved a thread the family meant to cut. What began as rumor was now paper, and paper can damn. Before I take you deeper, share this, if it chills you, and subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. These are not legends, they are records. The drawer contained more than letters. Receipts, unsigned, anonymous, showed the purchase of distilled opium, bromide salts, and foxglove extract. The seller, a chemist in Albany known for discretion. The invoices carried no prices, suggesting a retainer arrangement rather than retail sale. Here the pattern sharpens. The official story was one of frailty. The hidden truth was administration. Each letter marked adjustments, increase, suppress, sustain, as if Anna May were not a daughter, but an instrument. In another recovered letter, H.K. warned, "Do not allow her to be seen. The public must believe in miracle, not malady." That phrasing, miracle, not malady, would recur in sermons funded by the Beaumont Fund, delivered to congregations who sang hymns in her name. Ellery's deposition also notes that Mr. Beaumont employed a man who never appeared in household rosters. He lingered at the edge of gatherings, never speaking. Ellery swore the man carried a leather portfolio and shadowed visitors who asked too many questions. Surveillance, even then, was part of the architecture. By 1856, neighbors remarked that the family received more deliveries than any other townhouse on the avenue. Yet Anna May was never seen at a window, never wheeled into a garden. One neighbor, herself a widow, wrote in a letter to her sister, "It is not convalescence I perceive there, but concealment." The ledger too began to swell. Alongside medicinal drafts, HK, came new entries. Special services, EF, and correspondence fee, T. EF and T remain unidentified, but the structure is plain. Initials as code, amounts unlisted, payments concealed within the guise of household maintenance. It was the drawer that opened the first crack. From it spilled evidence not of accident, not of divine sleep, but of orchestration, with Anna May as both subject and currency. The next letter in that bundle would mark the beginning of escalation, a directive not merely to sustain her condition, but to profit from it, and the cost of exposure, HK warned, would not be borne by him. By the late 1850s, the pattern had hardened into system. The HK letters no longer read as clinical updates, but as coded memoranda, half medical, half financial. One recovered page reads, "The angel remains compliant. Curtains drawn. Begin L series. Dosage tied to dividend schedule." The word dividend appeared in more than one letter, stitching her condition directly to Beaumont investments. The code itself grew baroque. Phrases like hymnal referred to opiates, sermon to bromides, communion to foxglove. Collection plate meant the sympathy donations funneled into the Beaumont Fund. To the public, these were metaphors of faith. In the letters, they were a ledger of substances and sums. A surviving account book, recovered in 1879 from a warehouse fire, showed initials stretching beyond HK. Pages listed EF, T, MR, and S. Each initial was matched to disbursements under innocuous labels: upholstery, carriage repair, coal. But the cadence never varied. Each payment coincided with an adjustment to Anna May's regimen. It was not only paper. Witnesses began to feel the net. A tutor, brought in briefly to read French poetry at Anna May's bedside, testified decades later that he was followed after leaving the townhouse. He described a man in a bowler hat standing at the edge of Union Square 2 nights in a row, carrying a leather case. When the tutor attempted to confront him, the man vanished into the crowd. The tutor left the city within weeks. Before I go deeper into this surveillance web, pause here and comment if you believe institutions can be trusted with secrets. And make sure you subscribe, because each section of this series peels another layer of disguise. The surveillance was not improvisation, it was orchestrated. Police reports, obtained from the 9th Precinct archives, revealed that neighbors who asked too many questions were accused of petty crimes, VA, Grancy, theft, disorderly conduct. Each charge evaporated once they left the avenue. One constable's margin note reads simply, "Fund covers it." The ledger's expansion mirrored the spread of influence. By 1860, the Beaumont Fund financed not only sermons, but a wing of a private sanitarium upstate. HK's letters shifted tone. Should the angel stir, relocate to the wing. Public must never know. That wing was later demolished, its records burned, but a single receipt from its carpenter survives, listing iron restraints as part of the furnishing. The code crept into sermons themselves. Ministers praised Anna May as a miracle untouched by the corruption of waking life, repeating phrasing lifted directly from HK's correspondence. Faith and fraud were braided into the same rope. The fund collected donations nationwide. The longer she slept, the heavier the purse. Neighbors whispered, servants vanished. The windows stayed black. Yet the official story remained radiant, the sleeping angel, a beacon of innocence, an emblem of charity. What the public adored was a portrait. What the letters reveal was a machine. The last page of the 1861 ledger is the sharpest cut. Beneath the coded entries, one line, plain, without disguise. Target secured. AM. Indefinite. The story darkens here, where ledgers ceased to be tools of concealment and became weapons of intention. In the winter of 1862, the Beaumont Fund's account books, kept in an otherwise impeccable hand, shifted from coded references to direct instructions. One entry, stripped of euphemism, read simply, AM must remain. Her awakening jeopardizes all. This was no longer about sustaining a frail girl for sympathy's sake. It was about containment. Anna May's condition, once a spectacle, had become a liability. Too many had seen her stir. Too many had heard fragments of words she should not have known. A maid, before she was dismissed, recalled Anna May whispering at night, phrases in German, the language of trade correspondences her father conducted but never taught his daughter. Another noted she called for names not in her circle. Bankers, legislators, even an alderman. Somehow, drugged and bedbound, Anna May was reciting the geography of her family's power. The ledger began to reflect this fear. Payments grew larger, scattered across multiple fronts. Sanitarium retainers doubled. Press donations appeared under the guise of hymn book printing. Private protection fees surfaced, paid to unnamed watchmen. Each was annotated with a chilling refrain. Performance must not falter. Before I continue, if you're following this descent, share the story with someone who still believes institutions are innocent. And subscribe, because these records will not survive the fire a second time. The knife twist is not metaphorical. Among the preserved fragments of HK's correspondence is a note, unsigned but confirmed in his handwriting. If awakening persists, stronger measures, a cure worse than malady, but necessary. The words echoed a doctrine whispered in asylums of the era, eradication through permanent sedation. Surveillance tightened. A neighbor claimed she saw a figure ride from the house at dusk, small, frail, wrapped in shawls. But the next day, the Beaumonts hosted a public prayer circle, assuring visitors Anna May lay peacefully upstairs. The contradiction was deliberate. It was misdirection, the same method used in stagecraft and politics alike. And then came the most damning artifact, a slip from the ledger in June 1863, listing names under a column titled Exposure Threats. There were 3, T.E., Thomas Ellery, the footman who had testified, M.S., a maid whose psalms stirred Anna's attempted speech, A.M., Anna May herself, her own initials reduced to a threat to be neutralized. The handwriting beside it is icily plain, resolution required. The betrayal is complete here. The girl the public called an angel, the girl whose image graced sermons and symphonies, was not merely controlled. She was identified as a target by her own family's machinery. What began as guardianship twisted into weaponized silence. The same system that kept her asleep now plotted to erase her entirely if the performance failed. The next section of this record exposes how containment escalated into public manipulation, how newspapers, clergy, and physicians conspired to ensure that Anna May's sleep endured not as mercy, but as currency. By 1864, Anna May was no longer simply the Beaumont's daughter. She was a commodity threaded through pulpits, broadsheets, and lecture halls. The ledger showed it plainly, a sudden spike in donations to local newspapers, followed by glowing serialized stories that portrayed her sleep as both divine punishment and divine reward. Readers wept at the notion of a girl spared from the vulgarities of waking life. Few noticed that every article repeated the same phrases that first appeared in HK's private correspondence. The pulpit took the refrain next. Ministers funded by the Beaumont Fund delivered sermons in which Anna May was described as a living martyr, preserved so that the city might repent. Congregants left coins in collection plates that were later funneled into the fund's accounts, and each hymn sung in her name lengthened the ledger of complicity. The reach did not stop with faith or print. Medicine itself bent to the narrative. When murmurs spread that Anna May stirred at readings or whispered names in her sleep, physicians were summoned to declare it a symptom of hysteria latent in the female constitution. Reports were issued, cloaked in authority, insisting that her mutterings were the incoherent babble of a damaged mind. Weaponized psychiatry did more than silence suspicion. It branded Anna May herself as unreliable, even in sleep. Should she ever awaken, the groundwork was already laid. She would be dismissed as unstable, her testimony void. In one report, attributed to Dr. Kincaid himself, the phrase chills even in its restraint. Recovery, if achieved, will be madness. Commitment advised. Before we continue, if this story unsettles you, comment with the word truth and subscribe. These records surface only because someone before us refused to burn them. Neighbors watched the contradictions mount. Deliveries of tonics and restraints increased, yet the family staged prayer circles declaring Anna May's peace untouched. When one skeptical minister asked to see the girl, he was told she had just been visited by the physician and required absolute quiet. Within weeks, that minister accepted a new parish far from the city, his skepticism erased from the neighborhood. The press began to police dissent. Letters to editors questioning the miracle were labeled libelous. At least one skeptic, a bookseller on Broadway, was prosecuted under obscenity laws for distributing profane literature after stocking a pamphlet critical of the fund. His shop shuttered. His name vanished from city directories by 1866. The sanitarium upstate became the shadow stage. Funds poured into its expansion, earmarked as philanthropy, but invoices listed iron bedsteads, padded cells, and leather restraints. Survivors' accounts mention a wing where curtains were kept drawn at all hours, mirrors removed, and staff sworn to secrecy. That wing bore no name on maps. Its patients, if they can be called that, were never recorded in census rolls. Anna May's existence, once accidental spectacle, had been deliberately institutionalized. She was the pivot of a machine that fused charity, faith, journalism, and medicine into a single apparatus of control. And in that apparatus, her humanity dissolved into myth. The next records show how the cabal moved from defense to aggression, how even whispers of exposure triggered preemptive neutralization, and how the sanitarium became not refuge, but final enclosure. By the late 1860s, the Beaumont conspiracy had evolved from concealment into counterattack. Any voice that hinted at doubt, be it servant, neighbor, or physician, was swiftly encircled by surveillance and silenced by psychiatric discredit. The HK letters grew sharper in tone. One from 1868 survives in a family archive mislabeled as hymnal donations. It reads, "Whispers spread. Secure the perimeter. Employ watchers. Any relapse into wakefulness must be met with hysteria diagnosis. Transfer north if necessary." The phrasing was cold, stripped of ceremony, less a prescription than a command. Surveillance was no longer shadows at street corners. It became systematic. The Beaumont Fund began paying retainers to constables, reporters, even a telegraph clerk. Messages critical of the fund were intercepted before they reached presses. Servants dismissed from the house found themselves followed, sometimes arrested on trifles. One laundress, who claimed she heard Anna May sob during an airing of sheets, was committed within a month to the Hudson Valley Sanitarium. The charge, melancholia. She never reappeared in census records. Before I reveal more, pause and share this episode with one person who trusts newspapers without question. and subscribe, because the next documents prove how deeply the system devoured its own. The sanitarium itself became the looming threat. Records describe an unnamed special patient whose quarters were isolated, curtains nailed shut. Staff turnover was abnormally high. Nurses who stayed more than a season signed confidentiality pledges enforced by debt. A carpenter's bill listed oak restraints fitted to youth dimensions, a chilling indication that Anna May, or someone like her, was not left simply to sleep, but bound into silence. Weaponized psychiatry now reached beyond Anna May's chamber. Anyone sympathetic to her became a target of diagnosis. Hysteria, melancholia, religious mania, labels applied as swiftly as ink could dry. A local curate who questioned why donations never reached parish poorhouses was declared unfit and quietly relieved of duty. His sermons ceased. His name faded. The ledger mirrored this aggression. By 1870, entries included neutralization, EF, transfer north, confirmed, legal retainer, sanitarium board. Each note was an erasure, each payment a blade. One final HK note, dated August 1871, stripped away all metaphor. Awakening will be ruin. If stirrings persist, move her permanently. Records already prepared. The sanitarium was no longer a contingency. It was the endgame. And within a year, the public story hardened. The sleeping angel remained untouched, the Beaumonts praised as saints, donations surging in the aftermath of the Civil War. The truth that Anna May hovered between life and confinement, between memory and erasure, was buried beneath sermons, headlines, and psychiatric decrees. The next phase exposes how the containment climaxed, the last gambit, when documents were scattered across press, prosecutors, and detectives in a desperate bid to pierce the machine. By 1871, pressure inside the Beaumont machine had begun to buckle. The longer Anna May remained hidden, the more servants, clerks, and neighbors carried fragments of the truth. Some whispered in taverns, others scribbled letters to distant cousins. A few, reckless or righteous, tried to deliver their knowledge to men who could act. The archives record a sequence of 3 desperate drops. The first was to the press. An unsigned envelope arrived at the office of the Evening Post in July 1871. Inside, a fragment of the ledger, the initials AM and the phrase "resolution required." The editor showed it to his publisher. The publisher showed it to a Beaumont trustee. Within days, the envelope was dismissed as forgery, the editor promoted, and the fragment vanished. The second drop was to a prosecutor. In August, an anonymous packet reached the desk of Assistant District Attorney Edward Faraday. Contained within were receipts for laudanum shipments marked with the Beaumont crest. Faraday, ambitious but cautious, opened an inquiry. 2 weeks later, his superior reassigned him to maritime disputes. He left public service within the year. The packet was never logged. The third drop was the boldest. In September, a man known only as T approached a private detective, Jonas Keene, with copies of HK's letters. Keene, a veteran of fraud cases, agreed to investigate. Within a fortnight, he was found drowned in the East River, pockets filled with stone. The coroner ruled it accident. His notes, if he kept any, were never found. Before I reveal what followed, comment if you believe truth can ever be buried forever, and subscribe, because this descent is built on the bones of those who tried and failed to speak. These failed gambits reveal the full scale of containment. The machine did not simply deflect suspicion, it absorbed it. Newspapers were financed, prosecutors displaced, detectives eliminated. Each countermove was faster than the accusation itself, as though a blueprint of suppression had been drafted years in advance. And all the while, Anna May lay silent. Witnesses swore she stirred, that she whispered scripture, that she pressed fingers against sheets as if trying to rise. Each flicker of humanity was catalogued as symptom, dismissed as delusion, or answered with increased dosage. One letter from HK in September 1871 is nearly triumphant in tone. All avenues closed, public enamored, funds secure. Proceed with transfer as arranged. The transfer was to the sanitarium. Preparations were meticulous. Household staff were dismissed in waves, their silence purchased with wages or threatened with debtor's prison. A new staff, imported from the sanitarium itself, took their places. Deliveries increased. Restraints, tinctures, blank registers. The Beaumonts staged a farewell vigil, inviting society matrons to pray for their daughter's continued rest. Tears flowed. Newspapers published woodcuts of Anna May in repose, her features imagined by illustrators who had never seen her. Donations doubled. And then, behind the curtains, wagons rolled north at dusk. Inside, records suggest, lay a frail body swathed in linen, bound not by prayer, but by leather. It was the last anyone outside the fund ever saw of Anna May Beaumont. The next records unravel what became of her within the sanitarium. The staged breakdown, the falsified medical charts, and the erasure of a life rewritten as madness. The Hudson Valley Sanitarium, a sprawling compound of brick and iron half hidden among elms, had already acquired a reputation by 1872. Locals called it the Quiet Farm, but its walls told another story. Windows nailed shut, corridors that smelled of lime wash and ether, guards who doubled as attendants. Into this place, under the cover of dusk, Anna May was delivered. Her admission records survive only in fragments, misfiled invoices, a physician's notebook, but together they expose the orchestration of a breakdown. One chart lists symptoms in a neat column: delirium, hysteria, religious mania, mutism, refusal of nourishment. Yet cross-referencing with household servant accounts shows these were not her symptoms before transfer. They were assigned upon arrival, as though the diagnosis preceded the patient. The newspapers followed within days. The Times printed, "Tragedy of the Angel. Sudden madness overtakes the sleeping girl." Readers gasped, prayers redoubled, and the fund swelled again. The irony was surgical. Anna May's so-called madness had been scripted by the very doctors who claimed to cure her. Before I reveal how this charade was maintained, comment "awake" if you're still with us in this descent, and subscribe, because what comes next is the darkest turn yet. Inside the sanitarium, Anna May was isolated, curtains nailed, mirrors removed, attendants forbidden to address her directly. Records describe her as agitated upon wakening, a phrase that conceals more than it tells. A nurse's private note, smuggled in a hymnal margin, offers a sharper picture. The girl spoke her name. She asked where her mother was. She cried when given draft. They called it symptom. I call it cruelty. That nurse disappeared from payroll the following month. The ledger entries mirror this new phase. Household accounts ceased. Sanitarium disbursements took their place. Mont Ayes. Actually, notations read, Room 6C, curtains drawn. Doses increased. Visitation restricted. Beside each, the initials HK. Meanwhile, the public was fed a narrative of decline. Ministers preached that Anna May's sleep had become a cautionary tale of pride subdued by providence. The subtext was clear. Her fate was not injustice but morality, a sermon clothed in tragedy. The staged breakdown was the final seal. To the outside world, Anna May had transitioned from miracle to madness. Within the sanitarium, she was unpersoned, a living body reduced to an entry on a chart, a ledger line, a sermon's metaphor. The cruelest irony lies in a final phrase found in Kincaid's last surviving letter from 1872. Containment successful, angel is ours. But institutions never destroy evidence completely. The next section will uncover what scraps remained after the fire. Burned correspondence, altered registers, and testimonies hidden in mislabeled boxes, proof that the aftershocks of Anna May's erasure rippled long after her chamber door was closed. By 1873, the Beaumont narrative was sealed in public memory. The angel of Fifth Avenue had passed into divine sleep, then divine madness, a cautionary tale wrapped in velvet. Newspapers spoke of her with reverence. Pulpits invoked her as an emblem of frailty. The sanitarium listed her as Patient AM, deceased. And with that entry, the family declared the story closed. But history does not obey declarations. In the archives of county courthouses, in mislabeled boxes of lamp oil receipts and supply tallies, fragments survive. ashes of the truth the fire could not consume. In late 1873, a suspicious blaze gutted the sanitarium's east wing. Officially, it was attributed to a faulty stove. Unofficially, attendants recalled the smell of kerosene long before flames erupted. In the rubble, investigators found half-charred ledgers, entries still legible, names still intact. Among them, Room 6C, laudanum doubled. Curtains nailed, visitation denied. Commitment indefinite, AM. One scrap, blackened at the edge, bore a single phrase that chilled even hardened clerks. Erase the record, not the girl. Before I show you how those scraps resurfaced decades later, comment if you believe fire cleanses or only conceals, and subscribe, because the evidence that survived tells a story the Beaumonts never wanted written. The Beaumont Fund moved swiftly. Within weeks of the blaze, donations tripled under the banner of Rebuilding for the Sick. Clergy preached that the fire was divine judgment, sparing Anna May from further suffering. The sanitarium wing was never reconstructed. Instead, the site was paved into ornamental gardens. Yet 3 items escaped. A nurse's diary, singed but intact, smuggled out by her brother. It described Anna May's final days, lucid moments dismissed as delusion, pleas for water silenced by drafts. A charred ledger page, rescued by a clerk, who slipped it into his personal Bible. That page listed disbursements labeled protection, press retainer, and, on the final line, resolution. A letter fragment, ink blurred by heat, reading only. Her testimony, if ever public, will unmake us. The sanitarium was rebuilt in stone and silence. No plaque bore Anna May's name. No census marked her. She was reduced to sermons and serialized tales, half miracle, half caution. The Beaumonts themselves ascended higher. Their fortune survived the panic of 1873, their name etched on libraries and museums. By the time of their patriarch's death in 1889, obituaries hailed him as a saint of industry. But fragments remained, hidden in files never meant to be opened, and when archivists stumbled across them decades later, they painted a different portrait, not of a sleeping angel, but of a girl engineered into silence, her life siphoned into coin and reputation. The next section draws out the quiet testimonies, the servants who vanished, the nurses who whispered, the detectives who drowned. These scattered voices, ignored in their own time, now converge into a single refrain. Anna May did not die of illness. She was contained until memory itself was strangled. The official story was clean, too clean. By 1875, the Beaumont family's version of events had been canonized in sermons, serialized in penny presses, and etched into the ledgers of philanthropy. But beneath that marble facade lay voices that had been smothered, displaced, or disappeared. It is those voices that now seep back through archival cracks. Consider the servants. Their names seldom appear in public records, yet scraps of testimony survive in depositions and unsigned letters. One laundress, dismissed abruptly in 1866, dictated her account to a parish clerk. The girl called out in English, plain as I speak. She said, "Tell them I am awake." But the doctor scolded me, said my ears were bewitched. 2 days later, my post was ended. A cook, interviewed years later under oath in a civil dispute, swore she saw Anna May walking unsteadily in her chamber one morning, grasping the mantel for balance. She was no angel in sleep. She was waking, and they feared it. Her testimony was struck from the record as hearsay. Even a stable boy left his trace. In a letter to his cousin, preserved only because it was tucked into a probate file, he wrote, "The house is wrong. Curtains nailed, cries in the night, men with ledgers coming and going. It is not illness, it is imprisonment." He vanished from directories after 1867. Before I show you how these testimonies coalesce into a pattern, comment if you believe truth outlives suppression, and subscribe, because the chorus of the forgotten is louder than any sermon. The nurses' voices are quieter, yet more damning. One unsigned diary fragment, smuggled into the margins of a hymnal, described Anna May's final years at the sanitarium. She prays when the drafts lessen. She remembers her name. She asks for water, for light. When I answer, I am told to cease. They call her words madness. I call them survival. Another attendant. His payroll receipt includes a cryptic note, silence purchased, paid double. Detective records whisper similar truths. A private investigator, hired discreetly by a distant relative, filed a single report in 1872. Subject alive, coherent, though weakened. Restricted access. Physicians rehearsed narrative for visitors. Recommend legal action. Weeks later, the detective drowned, ruled accident. His report remained sealed until 1901, misfiled under canal damage claims. All these testimonies point to a single trajectory. Anna May was not lost to illness, but preserved in a state of enforced silence. The servants who heard her stir, the nurses who saw her lips form words, the detectives who glimpsed her as human, all were erased, dismissed, or destroyed. The suppression was systemic. Clergy labeled testimonies blasphemous, newspapers ignored affidavits, courts struck depositions, the sanitarium consumed dissenters with diagnoses, and the Beaumont Fund kept the ledger balanced. Yet in the very act of suppression, evidence multiplied. Scraps of letters, stray diary lines, margin notes, all survived because the system could not erase every fragment. The next section examines those scraps in forensic detail. Coded ledgers, scorched correspondence, telegrams half sent. Together, they form the mosaic of a crime hidden in plain sight. By the 1880s, the Beaumont Fund was at its zenith, its name carved into libraries and concert halls, its patriarch lionized as a patron saint of industry. Yet buried within county archives and private collections are the fragments that tell the truth. When examined together, they form a forensic trail more damning than any confession. The ledgers are the spine. Though many were burned in the sanitarium fire of 1873, several pages survived, salvaged by clerks who could not bring themselves to destroy everything. Their handwriting is precise, their entries chilling. Alongside line items for coal and lamp oil appear notes coded yet clear. Drafts doubled. HK, visitation denied, AM, room 6C secured, no costs listed, only initials, as if coin itself would sully the sanctity of control. Then there are the burned letters. Charred and half-legible, they reveal what the fund never meant the public to see. One fragment, preserved in a private law library, reads, "Should awakening occur, escalate dosage. Records prepared for transfer. Public must never..." The final word is lost to fire, but the cadence is familiar, silencing, not healing. Another letter fragment, its ink blurred by heat, contains only 5 words. Erase testimony. Preserve the miracle. Before I unravel the telegrams, comment if you think fragments can outlive whole archives, and subscribe, because the scraps left behind are louder than the stories they tried to script. The telegram trail may be the most revealing. Telegraph clerks, paid retainers of the fund, logged messages that were meant to vanish. Yet one operator, either careless or deliberate, kept carbon copies. Among them, to HK, March 1871, Angel stirs, expedite transfer north. To Beaumont Patriarch, June 1872. Coverage secured, times will print, vigil arranged. To Sanitarium Director, September 1872, ensure charts reflect hysteria. Commitment indefinite. Each message a stitch in the same dark fabric. Together, they prove what sermons denied, that Anna May's sleep was engineered, her silence choreographed, her erasure rehearsed. The mosaic of fragments, ledgers, burned letters, telegrams, does more than expose a conspiracy. It reveals an institution where faith, finance, and medicine conspired in chorus. The Beaumont Fund was not charity, it was theatre. Its stage was a young woman's life, curated for profit and reputation. One final ledger page, scorched but legible, ends with words more damning than all the rest. Performance concluded, records cleansed, memory unmade. Yet here the conspirators erred. Memory cannot be unmade. Even scraps carry the weight of truth. The next section turns to the public afterlife of Anna May, the way her story was refashioned into folklore, hymn, and parlor tale, a legend drained of blood but sharpened into myth. By the 1890s, Anna May had been buried not only in sanitarium records, but also in the collective imagination of a city eager for parables. Her true life, engineered silence, orchestrated sedation, was stripped away. In its place bloomed the myth of the sleeping angel, a story retold in parlors, pulpits, and serialized penny novels. The clergy seized her first. Sermons declared Anna May a living parable of patience, untouched by the noise of the age. Congregants were urged to imitate her submission. Donations were collected under her name, funding libraries whose marble plaques bore the Beaumont crest. No hymn ever mentioned laudanum or restraints, only purity and providence. The press followed, polishing her into a spectacle. Illustrated weeklies sketched her as a saintly figure in white, eyes closed in serenity. Readers mailed in coins for her care, long after her death had been quietly registered in sanitarium ledgers. By 1895, she had become a genre unto herself. Poems of eternal rest, paintings of a maiden in slumber. Parlor tales spread too. Housewives whispered that if a girl dreamt too much, she might be taken like the angel. Some claimed her sleep was a blessing, others a curse. In boarding schools, her story was a warning about disobedience. The truth, that her mutterings in German and English had been suppressed, was scrubbed away. Myth triumphed where memory was murdered. Before I take you into how this myth was exploited, comment if you've ever heard a legend that felt too polished, too rehearsed, and subscribe, because every myth has a ledger hidden beneath. The cultural afterlife was profitable. Sheet music publishers sold hymns dedicated to the sleeping angel. Portrait artists copied and recopied her likeness, often imagined, since few had ever seen her. Traveling lecturers invoked her name as proof of God's mysteries. Each retelling polished this marble further, until no soot or ledger ink seemed to remain. But myths are brittle when pressed. In the cracks of folklore, hints of the real Anna May survived. One anonymous pamphlet, circulated in 1898 under the title The Angel's Bonds, described her not as blessed, but as a girl bound by doses, sold to faith and finance alike. The pamphlet was banned as blasphemous, its printer fined, yet copies survived in attic trunks. Even children's rhymes carried distorted echoes. One version sung in schoolyards went, "Sleep, sweet Anna, never rise, curtains drawn to blind your eyes," a playground chant masking the truth of nailed curtains and blackened glass. The Beaumonts did not discourage the myth. They encouraged it. For every rumor of fraud, 10 tales of miracle were published. For every whisper of coercion, a sermon of providence rang louder. Yet time dulls grandeur. By the turn of the century, the angel of Fifth Avenue was remembered less as a girl and more as a symbol. And symbols, unlike flesh, do not fight back. The next section traces the turn of the century backlash, the moments when fragments of truth resurfaced in investigative journalism, when the myth cracked, and Anna May's story began to re-emerge not as folklore, but as evidence. By the first years of the 20th century, the Beaumont myth had calcified into civic legend. The sleeping angel adorned murals, her name whispered in sermons as shorthand for purity and patience. Yet in the era of muckrakers, journalists who clawed through soot and scandal, the story began to crack. In 1903, a reporter for the Evening Sun, Margaret Leland, uncovered a cache of sanitarium invoices, mislabeled as lamp oil expenses. She noticed irregularities, repeated charges for laudanum, bromides, and foxglove long after Anna May's supposed death. Her article, printed in August, was bold for its time. The angel was no miracle, she was a patient. Though quickly buried on page 6, it seeded doubt in a readership trained to accept marble saints at face value. Other journalists followed. Samuel Dwyer, writing for Harper's Weekly, traced the financials of the Beaumont Fund and found what he called a machinery of benevolence that gave nothing but smoke. His piece compared donation ledgers with sanitarium construction accounts, pointing to a siphoning of funds. Dwyer's editor was pressured to retract, but copies circulated in private circles. Before I go deeper, comment if you believe the press exposes more than it conceals, and subscribe because these next cracks show how myths bleed when pressed with evidence. Whispers reached legislators. In 1905, a state inquiry into charitable institutions briefly touched the Beaumont Fund. Testimony was cut short, but one clerk dared to speak. Ledger entries marked AM persisted into the 70s, no death certificate issued until years later. His words were stricken from the record, but stenographers carried memory. The cultural backlash spread in subtler ways. In literary salons, novelists began to use the angel as allegory, not of purity, but of corruption. A short story in the Atlantic Monthly depicted a family who drugged their daughter for inheritance. The resemblance was unmistakable. Plays staged in Bowery theaters mocked the hypocrisy of marble saints. The most dangerous crack came from photography. In 1908, a glass plate was discovered in the sanitarium ruins. It depicted a frail figure, eyes half open, seated in a chair with curtains nailed behind her. The inscription on the plate holder read, 6C. Whether it was anime cannot be proven, but the image was displayed quietly in private circles, its existence a quiet act of rebellion against the marble myth. The Beaumont name still carried power, but its sheen dulled. Patrons whispered, beneficiaries distanced themselves. The angel was no longer untouchable legend. She was becoming a contested memory. The next section unravels the aftermath of these cracks, how the Beaumont legacy tried to suffocate truth once more, and how archivists, decades later, pieced together the final ledger pages that proved Anime's silence was engineered, not divine. By 1910, the Beaumont name was beginning to corrode under scrutiny. For half a century, their fortune had gleamed in marble libraries and lecture halls, sanctified by sermons that repeated the tale of the sleeping angel. But as investigative journalism gained teeth, the family turned to their oldest habit, erasure. Their lawyers petitioned to seal court records for reasons of privacy. Newspapers that dared print dissent found themselves smothered by advertising withdrawals. Clergy, long nourished on fund stipends, thundered from pulpits that skepticism of the angel was blasphemy. Even photographs, like the mysterious plate of room 6C, vanished into private collections after collectors received quiet visits from men in dark coats. Yet the truth has a way of slipping through. In 1912, a junior archivist named Eleanor Crane catalogued a misfiled box labeled Railway Bonds, 1870s. Inside, she found not bonds, but ledger scraps and receipts from the Hudson Valley Sanitarium. She noted in her neat hand the chilling repetition of initials, AM, indefinite. Crane copied them before the box was reclaimed. Her notes, smuggled into her private journal, are what preserved those fragments today. Before I reveal how these fragments surfaced in later decades, comment if you believe archives protect truth or bury it. And subscribe, because what follows is the story of resistance against manufactured memory. The Beaumonts attempted damage control through philanthropy. They poured millions into hospitals, universities, even the construction of a cathedral wing. Each donation came with plaques and marble inscriptions designed to overwrite suspicion with grandeur. The angel's story was woven into stained glass windows, her slumber painted as holy endurance. The truth was not just suppressed, it was rebranded. But resistance lingered in the margins. Nurses' families preserved diaries. Former servants, long dead, left behind letters that surfaced in estate sales. Archivists like Crane made quiet copies before sealing boxes again. The fragments traveled hand to hand, attic to attic, until whispers of conspiracy never fully vanished. By the 1920s, reformers in mental health seized on the story as allegory. Pamphlets circulated in small numbers, warning that women were too easily committed for hysteria. Though the Beaumont name was rarely cited, the shadow of Anna May hung heavy. Reformers spoke of a girl erased by drafts and curtains, and audiences understood. The family's official histories ignored her entirely. Beaumont biographies printed in 1925 mentioned philanthropy, politics, and railroads, but not a daughter. The omission was itself a kind of gravestone, a life omitted so thoroughly it might have never existed. Yet the omissions made scholars dig deeper. Each gap, each sealed record, each vanished photograph drew more suspicion. And when the Beaumont mansion was finally demolished in 1934, workmen found behind a paneled wall a scorched ledger fragment bearing 3 words that no marble plaque could wash away. performance, not mercy. The next section traces the mid-20th century rediscovery, how historians, archivists, and reformers pieced together these scraps, reframing anime not as a miracle, but as America's earliest documented case of institutionalized erasure for profit. By the middle of the 20th century, the world had shifted. Wars had redrawn nations, reformers had begun to pry open asylums, and historians were learning to read silence as carefully as they read text. It was in this climate that Anna-May Beaumont's fragments resurfaced. In 1948, historian Dr. Leonard Hale, researching the rise of private philanthropies, stumbled across Eleanor Crane's handwritten notes in an unlabeled folder at the State Archives. The scrawl was faded, but the words A.M. indefinite, burned through. Hale, curious, began threading together scraps, sanitarium invoices, censored telegrams, and half-burned letters. Each piece hinted at something darker than legend. By the 1950s, reformers in the mental health movement seized on Hale's findings. Pamphlets began to circulate with titles like "The Angel Was No Angel" and "Curtains Drawn, Curtains Nailed." They argued that Anna-May's fate symbolized a broader cruelty, women confined, medicated, and silenced under the guise of hysteria. Though often dismissed as radical, these pamphlets spread among students and activists. Before I tell you how these fragments entered public conscience, comment if you believe truth always returns, no matter how long it sleeps. And subscribe, because Anna-May's reappearance was not accident, it was inevitability. The Beaumont legacy fought back. In 1956, the family sponsored a lavish centennial exhibition at a major museum. Marble busts, portraits, and silver ledgers were displayed under the banner, "A Century of Charity." Anna-May was omitted entirely. Yet Hale, in his review for American Archivist, slipped in a single line. What is charity when its foundation is silence? The family threatened suit, but the question lingered. The 1960s brought louder cracks. Feminist scholars began rereading sanitarium histories, pointing out how madness diagnoses often mirrored patriarchal convenience. One essay, "The Sleeping Angel and the Silenced Women," 1967, explicitly linked Anna-May to a pattern of enforced erasure. It was no longer legend, no longer hushed. It was case study. By the 1970s, student movements had adopted her as a symbol. Protest banners read, "Wake the Angel." Murals in New York painted her not as a sleeping saint, but as a bound figure behind nailed curtains. The myth was cracking. Archival work accelerated. Microfilm preserved the charred ledgers, telegram fragments, and sanitarium receipts. Scholars connected initials, HK, EF, T, to real figures, physicians, trustees, and legal clerks complicit in the scheme. What had once been rumor solidified into evidence. The irony was cruel but fitting. The very machinery built to erase Anna-May ended up documenting itself too well. Ledgers, invoices, receipts, the obsession with order became the thread that historians pulled. By the end of the 20th century, Anna-May was no longer a miracle or a myth. She was a victim documented into existence. The next section traces how the 21st century reframed her story through documentaries, digital archives, and public reckoning, transforming Anna-May from forgotten pawn to enduring emblem of institutional betrayal. The turn of the 21st century transformed Anna-May Beaumont from a forgotten cautionary tale into a subject of reckoning. With digitization, fragments once locked in dusty boxes were scanned, catalogued, and released into public databases. Anyone with patience and a search bar could now trace the smudged initials, the scorched ledger pages, the telegrams that once traveled only in shadows. In 2004, the New York Historical Society unveiled a small exhibition titled "Curtains Drawn, The Hidden History of the Sleeping Angel." For the first time, the public saw the burned ledger fragments behind glass, the telegram slips with their stark commands, "Angel stirs, expedite transfer north." Visitors left shaken. Newspapers reported long lines, and op-eds debated whether the Beaumont name should still grace libraries and museums. Documentarians soon followed. A 2011 PBS special, "The Angel in Room 6C," juxtaposed archival evidence with reenactments lit in cold chiaroscuro. The narration was blunt. Anime had not been preserved by miracle, but engineered into silence. Letters from viewers poured in, many drawing parallels to modern abuses of psychiatric power. Before I tell you how her story echoes in present institutions, comment if you believe history always repeats itself, and subscribe, because Anime's ghost is not just past, but present. Universities took up the case. Courses in women's history and medical ethics taught Anime alongside more well-known tragedies of confinement. Students debated whether she was America's first documented victim of institutional erasure for profit. Journals published analyses of HK's letters, highlighting the cold intertwining of medicine, money, and morality. Cultural memory shifted. Where murals once painted her as a saint, modern artists reimagined her as a figure resisting nailed curtains, pressing against glass blackened by fear. Performance artists staged reenactments in abandoned hospitals, whispering her phrases, "Tell them I am awake," into audiences that sat in stunned silence. Even legal reform bore her mark. In 2015, when activists pushed for transparency in psychiatric commitments, they cited Anime's case as emblematic of how silence can be weaponized. A senator from New York opened his speech with her name. "Let us not forget the girl in room 6C who slept not by choice but by command." The Beaumont legacy crumbled. Foundations once proud of their name began rebranding. Plaques were quietly removed. Descendants issued tepid statements of regret. Yet marble still bore the crest in libraries and cathedrals, silent witnesses to both philanthropy and fraud. Anime's story had crossed from myth to evidence, from evidence to emblem, and with that crossing came a new question, not what had been done to her, but what such erasure said about the country that allowed it. The final section brings us to the moral sting, the enduring lesson of Anime's silence, the survival of the system that profited from it, and the responsibility of those who inherit her fractured memory. The story of Anime Beaumont does not end in her chamber, nor in the sanitarium's burned wing, nor in the footnotes of archivists who copied fragments to keep them alive. It ends here, in the shadow of institutions that endured, polished their marble, and allowed a girl's life to become a ledger entry. For a century and a half, the public was told she was a miracle. Then, when that mask grew thin, she was recast as a madwoman. In truth, she was neither. She was a daughter sedated into silence, her body repurposed as theater, her very breath converted into coin. The machinery that contained her did not vanish. The tools remain familiar, newspapers that print on command, churches that sanctify profit, courts that strike inconvenient testimony, doctors who cloak control as care. What was orchestrated on Fifth Avenue in 1854 was not anomaly, but blueprint. Before I close this record, if you feel the weight of Anime's silence, share this story, subscribe, and remember, archives endure only when we demand they remain open. Her chamber may be gone, her name chiseled off plaques, her story rebranded into sermons, yet fragments refuse to die. Scraps of paper, ash-stained ledgers, telegram slips, all converged to resurrect what the fund meant to bury. Anime lives now in the record, not as angel nor invalid, but as evidence. And in that evidence lies the moral sting. Systems outlive individuals. The servants who whispered were silenced. The nurse who smuggled her diary vanished. The detective who probed was drowned. Even Anime herself was erased. But the machine, the fund, the sanitarium, the alliances of money and morality survived, polished, praised. The true chill is not in her fate, but in the fact that the apparatus around her still breathes. It takes different forms, different names, different justifications, but its heart is the same. Control disguised as profit clothed in sanctity, silence purchased with marble. Anime's last testimony may never be known in her own words, but the fragments, when pieced together, spell something darker than any sermon dared, that institutions can consume a life whole, then sell its memory as virtue. In every city where curtains are nailed, where records are sealed, where charity is rehearsed as theater, the angel of Fifth Avenue stirs again. What began in 1854 as a dinner collapse spiraled into a century of suppression, and what remains now is not miracle, not madness, but a warning carved in ash. Performance, not mercy.